Hello, I'm Tony Antolini. It's very nice to see you. We, of course, can't really see each other, but I'm pretending you're all here as you have been in past summers. Each talk that I give before these concerts will be approximately 45 minutes, and the musical examples will not be played in the middle of the talk. Instead, we have a new idea. We will have the examples, if there is time for much of that, at the end of each talk, and while the examples are playing, you will see pictures of the performers, so you can imagine who they are when you hear the actual concert. The music that you hear in this series will all be taken, the examples will be taken from the archives of Bay Chamber concerts. These are not samples taken from some other source. There are many resources that you can have at any time that you would like to add to your enjoyment of this experience, and they are free. Most of them are free. Never forget the great value we have of YouTube. YouTube performances include all kinds of wonderful videos where you can see the performers playing. There is, of course, also the subscriber series such as YouTube Music and Spotify, but you don't have to spend money on that if you don't feel like it. For those of you who are interested in a truly educational experience, if you use Google and type in the name of the piece, you can find sometimes, in many cases with this repertoire, the score, and you can watch the score as you listen to the music. It's a great way to sharpen your music reading skills. So I'm going to be gesturing to my assistant, whom you cannot see, but who would certainly deserve applause if you could give it, and that's Josie Davis. She is doing all of the production work for these presentations. Now, usually when we meet, we have questions and answers at the end of these series. And I'd love to be able to have your questions, your comments, and so I'm giving you now on the screen an opportunity to see how to get in touch with me. You can email me, and if I understand the technology, you can hear my voice and see the slide at the same time. I'm also on Facebook Messenger, and even though we can't have live questions and discussion, please feel free to get in touch with me. I'd love to hear from you and hear any suggestions you may have. Hello. Thank you for tuning in once again. Today we are going to meet a new person to Bay Chamber concerts, at least new to me, and I don't think that this composer has appeared here in Rockport before. Her name is Michi Wiancko, and she has been commissioned to write a piece which will be premiered here in a live stream performance. A little bit about her, and then she will greet you herself. Michi is a composer, an arranger, and also a violinist. If you go to her website, you can just type in your search engine, Michi Wiancko. You can read about her numerous commissions, and her music goes a very wide range. It isn't just chamber music. She is involved in music for films and music for commercial uses. She has her own band called Kono Michi, and she has written an opera which was completed in 2019, just a year ago, called Murasaki's Moon. And you can see at least part of this in a video on her website. She went to Cleveland Institute of Music and then to Juilliard for her master's degree. She's based in New York City. But she also has a farm in Gill, Massachusetts, called Antenna Cloud Farm, which is a former dairy farm where she produces all kinds of fascinating chamber music experiments and performances. So I'm very glad to be able to introduce her to you, and then she will say a few more words about this commission. The title of this work is To Unpathed Waters, Undreamed Shores, and the performers are the Jupiter String Quartet. Now, Jupiter needs a little bit of an introduction too. This is a very unusually close-knit quartet. As most quartets go, there's quite a lot of family relationship here. The violinist is Nelson Lee, first violinist, and the second violinist is Megan Freivogel. The violist is Liz Freivogel, who is the sister of the second violinist, Megan Freivogel. The cellist, Daniel McDonough, is married to Megan, the violinist. And then, they are quite a family group. They're based at the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana, the music school there. If you are interested in learning more about the Jupiter String Quartet, they have a wonderful website which is generous with videos. You could also see reviews, photos, and lists of their performances. Now, often the name of a quartet is just used and people have no idea where it came from. But they're very smart and they tell why. The quartet was formed when Jupiter was the most prominent planet in the sky. So that's how it got its name.
Hi, my name is Michi Wiancko, and I would like to thank Bay Chamber Concerts for helping to usher in a brand new work of mine written for the Jupiter String Quartet called To Unpathed Waters, Undreamed Shores. This piece is in 7 movements, and while it's a musical response to issues surrounding climate change and the need to envision an inclusive future where we help protect each other, it is at its core a celebration of the vitality and the resilience of our planet, as well as an exploration surrounding the notion of hope. So I hope you'll be able to join us. Thank you.
So today we're also going to talk about a huge work by Ludwig van Beethoven, which will also be played by the Jupiter String Quartet. As with other giants of a period, I don't want to take our precious time with going through Beethoven's life, since I'm sure most of you have heard the story many times. And if you haven't, there are thousands of sources of information about this fascinating man who rose above one of the worst afflictions a musician can have, which is deafness. So we will go right to the piece which you will hear on this performance, which is the string quartet in A minor, opus 132. Now, as is often the case, it's very interesting and important to know the circumstances surrounding how a piece gets written and why it has certain unusual features. And in this case, the personal story of Beethoven makes a great deal of sense if you know it when you're listening to the piece. He worked on it for quite a long period of time, and the reason why is that he became quite ill. They think now that it had something to do with his digestive function, but he was very ill for a long time and quite weak. So the piece was worked on, and then he took to his bed, and then eventually he got better, and he completed it in the summer of the following year, 1825. As is the case with most of Beethoven's works, this was a commissioned piece. The commissioner in this case was a Russian nobleman, the Prince Golitsyn, who was also not only a wealthy Russian noble, but an amateur cellist. Whether Galitzin actually played the cello part of this piece, I don't know. It's entirely possible that he did. It follows some of the obvious conformities of string quartets, but within that conformity there is a lot of experimentation. So you have 4 movements, and then Beethoven got so sick that the piece was laid aside, and when he got better, he decided that he needed to insert a special movement as a thank you to the deity for his recovery, and I will tell you more about that in a few minutes. It's a longish piece, 45 minutes to play in its entirety. The first performance was done privately in a bar, the Tavern zum Wilden Mann in Vienna. That's the Wild Man bar in Vienna. 14 people heard it. And then later, it was played by the Schuppanzig Quartet, which is a group that played many of Beethoven's premieres. The first public performance took place later in the year. So 1825 is really the marker for this piece. We start in A minor, and later in the second movement we'll move to A major. Now, there's something already quite unusual about this piece. I mentioned earlier that even though it conforms to the outer design of a string quartet, there's some odd things here that you might want to explore if you're really interested in Beethoven and doing some sleuthing. There are 2 other pieces, that one comes just before and one after the quartet, Opus 131, and the big fugue, the Grosse Fuge, Opus 133, that come before and after this piece, have some very interesting similarities to this piece. Some melodic similarities, some rhythmic similarities. So one wonders, what was Beethoven thinking about, since he certainly wasn't lacking for good ideas? Different books explain this in different ways. Some believe that it is a deliberate kind of grouping of experimentation with the ideas. And in another explanation of the way Beethoven thought things through, he had a kind of earworm of some of these materials, and lying there on his bed week after week, month after month, he kind of mentally experimented with these. And so that earworm created a kind of sequential operation in 3 different completely separate works, namely 131, 132, and 133. So in the first movement, it starts, even though it's marked assai sostenutus, sustained, rather sustained, and then allegro, it essentially is a slow, kind of moody introduction, and then we get going with the expected fast first movement. Now, he experiments, as we've seen before in several things we've been listening to this summer. Instead of 2 themes in sonata form, he has 3. And he is, as Mozart did before him, experimenting with how much he can use the sonata form, but with more material to play around with. Second movement goes to what is called the parallel major. So we started in A minor, Do, Re, Mi. Now we're in A major, Do, Re, Mi. And if you listen to this without being told very much about it, you might say, well, it kind of sounds like a minuet and trio. Now, notice he doesn't call it that. He labels this Allegro ma non tanto, fast but not too fast. And yet, it is clearly dance-inspired. This is a kind of minuet and trio operation without calling it that. So the middle part, the trio part, is actually repeated. But the thematic ideas are pretty clear when you listen to this. An A idea, a contrasting B idea, and then the return of A. Now, he has to create some contrast from the first movement, which is, of course, faster. So this creates a kind of nostalgic mood. But one of the most interesting things he does in this movement is create a kind of country music atmosphere, because the first violin plays a drone note. Now, drone means a note that's held. And there are various instruments that are characterized with drones. The most familiar to most people are bagpipes, where the player is playing a melody, and that's where you see their fingers moving on the melody, but there are other pipes coming out of the airbag that just play the same note all the time. The other instrument that does this is called a hurdy-gurdy. You may have seen these, especially you still see them in Europe, where the player is actually revolving a crank, and the crank is like the bow, but it agitates the strings. And some of the strings are playable, so you get a melody, but they also have drone strings that you can set, so the same note is being played. Now, Beethoven gets into this, and one might wonder, well, why would he be interested in that? It creates a kind of country atmosphere. This is definitely not the music of a salon. This is not highfalutin music. And it's interesting to me to think of this in terms of writing this for this Russian nobleman, because there is, in fact, country music in Russia that also uses this kind of hurdy-gurdy atmosphere where there is a drone tone, both bagpipes and hurdy-gurdies. So is Beethoven making a bow to country music here, Eastern European country music? I don't know, but it's definitely not a fancy first violin part. He also does something else here, which we've seen in other pieces that we've examined this summer. He quotes himself. And here it's a dance, an allemande, where the piece is unrelated to this one, but it must have come to him. Now, I'm enough of a romantic to imagine poor Beethoven lying on his bed, sick, wondering if he'll ever get better, wondering if he'll ever get stronger, and these tunes come through his head. So in a way, this is kind of like visiting with his mind while he's been confined. Third movement. Now we get to this hymn, which in the original is entitled Heiliger Dankgesang eines Genesenen an die Gottheit in der lydischen Tonart. Means a holy hymn of thanksgiving to the divinity by a convalescent. This Genesenen, as he's referring to himself, he's the Genesenen, a convalescent to the divinity. And he even says in the Lydian mode. Now, the Lydian mode goes back to much earlier music before Bach, in which you have the organization not of music in keys, but modes. And if you're interested in the modes, they go all the way back to ancient Greek music and the great mathematician, Greek mathematician Pythagoras, who did all kinds of theoretical treatises on how music was organized. Now, the Lydian mode is one of 7 modes that prevail in this system. There is actually an extension of those to other ones, but I won't get into that today. The Lydian mode happens to be like a major scale, but it has one note that sounds wrong to us. If we go do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, that's a major scale. Now, in the Lydian mode, the 4th degree is raised. Do, re, mi, fi, instead of do, re, mi, fa. And that mode is often used in ancient music in prayerful kind of meditative texts. And Beethoven would have known that. So he's deliberately evoking something very antique in his hymn of thanksgiving to God that he got better. He writes in the second section something else that's very interesting, neue Kraft fühlend. So this is almost like program music. Neue Kraft fühlend literally means feeling new strength. So he's feeling better, and he wants you to know that this music represents his regained strength. And then at another place, it indicates mit innigster Empfindung, with the most inner emotions. So this is Beethoven's kind of musical representation of how wonderful it is to feel better after he wasn't sure whether he'd pull through. We then go to a march. This is back to A major, no more Lydian mode. And like all good composers, he knows the value of contrast. So this will strike you as somewhat raucous compared to the hymn of thanksgiving. Then it goes to a kind of declarative recitatives, what you would see in oratorio or early opera, where someone is telling something, it's text. Here, of course, there is no orator. The first violinist becomes the orator and is making this musical speech, but there are no words. Then the other thing to notice here is that the quartet is out of balance deliberately. The first violinist is the one giving the speech, and the others are accompanying. It isn't democratic at all. Then we get to the fifth movement. Here he goes from the original key, A minor, to A major. Allegro appassionato is passionately fast. It goes right into this movement. It follows without pause. So as you are listening to the fourth movement, you may not at first realize you have then progressed to the fifth movement. This is in an experimental form. Some books call it a rondo form, some call it a sonata form. I drew a little diagram of this, A, B, A, C, A, B, A. Again, it's like a palindrome where you have a mirror image of itself with the C as a kind of folding point. The design of it is deliberately very symmetrical, and yet the symmetry of it doesn't prevent the composer from writing unbelievably inspired music. Here we have to switch from music to English literature because this particular piece has some very important connections to famous writers. T.S. Eliot was passionately fond of this piece, and of course he lived at a time where he could listen to recorded music. And in a letter to Stephen Spender, he refers to listening to this quartet on his record player, which, as good Englishman, he calls the gramophone. I find it quite inexhaustible to study. There is a sort of heavenly, or at least more than human gaiety about some of his later things, which one imagines might come to oneself as the fruit of reconciliation and relief after immense suffering. I should like to get something of that into verse before I die. So T.S. Eliot really got Beethoven's heartfelt expression of gratitude and relief after having suffered so badly. Then we also have another literary association with this piece. Aldous Huxley, in his Point Counterpoint, has a long reference to this quartet in a late chapter concerning the death of a major character in Point Counterpoint, whose name is Maurice Spandrell. And again, the theme has to do with addressing suffering and one's reaction to it. And of course, Beethoven is a champion of rising above the most terrible challenges. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you enjoy today's performances.